Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Joint Special Operations University's Quarterly Academic Forum. This forum is part of the Future of SOF series. I'm your host, Doug Jordan. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you to this engagement, and I use that word deliberately because audience interaction is one of the main reasons why we're here together for the next 2 days. This is our 10th JSOU Forum. Once each quarter, JSOU takes time to discuss matters related to the use and utility of special operations forces in a competitive global environment and highly complex intersectional and compound security challenges. This forum is entitled Strategic Influence and Compound and Communication Paradigms in a Compound Security Environment. The subject is both timely and provocative, and we've gathered an eclectic and diverse group of panelists representing joint and interagency organizations, as well as academic and corporate perspectives. We have an equally diverse group of participants representing numerous commands, agencies, think tanks, and academic institutions from around the world. Before we begin, I would like to cover some administrative points. All of the opinions in this forum are those of the presenters and may not necessarily represent the official views of the United States government, other governments, the Department of Defense, United States Special Operations Command, or the Joint Special Operations University. What I'd like to do now is introduce Dr. Ike Wilson, who's the president of Joint Special Operations University, who will set the scene for the 2 days, for the entire forum, and he will serve as our moderator for the first panel. His bio, along with all of the bios for the presenters, is in your program. Dr. Wilson, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Doug, our Master of Ceremonies today. And I just want to thank everyone, the whole team here at JSOU, as well as our great teammates going into our 3rd year running with DCE Productions. As Doug said, my name's Dr. Ike Wilson. I am the president of the Joint Special Operations University, or the JSOU. And it's a pleasure, as always, each quarter to serve as what I'll be serving as today as moderator for our panel 1. And in conjunction with that, in tradition of all of our quarterly forums, I'll be giving a upfront scene setter. My scene setter will be part of my moderator comments going and rolling straight into our panel 1 session, which will focus on the big question of what is strategic influence, and what I've added to it, the following question of how to achieve it. I mean, what we try to do with me as a scene setter, this is a scene setter not just for this initial panel, but it's a scene setter intended for the entire two-day forum. And so what I'm going to do, as I try to do every quarter, is put some ideas on the table. Our virtuous cycle model of applied learning and leader prep and development for the JSOU is an approach to applied everything, applied theory, an applicable applied history, long history to recent history, bringing us up to the current, and as always, beginning and ending with the imperatives of practice and praxis for the SOF professional at the X. And the X is changing. The X has changed at this moment of strategic inflection, and the X is changing dramatically in an accelerated pace. 2 changes of the X that I want to put up front as part of my provocation. What I try to do with these scene setters is, again, set a scene, but also do so in a way that kind of provokes. Maybe even raises some fervor and some anger among folks, puts big questions on the table, so we can get some energy in the virtual room, some heat in this virtual room to carry us forward on some exciting and relevant conversations to carry us through the 2-day event in schedule. But what this strategic inflection moment that we're at today brings forward, I'm gonna pose in first 3 questions. And again, I'm gonna have some slides up. I've got probably about 10 minutes or so to get a lot of material on the table and provoke and heat up this room as much as possible. So I'm gonna use some slides to sneak in the extra 10,000 words when I have time to articulate myself. 3 big questions I think that have to be asked and addressed, eventually answered for any major moment in long world history of continuity and change, any one of these moments of great transformational change. And most scholars and practitioners argue and agree, largely so, that this moment of change that we're in today tends to be one that stands out in long terms of history. An epochal moment of change, a change moment of transformational impacts and implications. Three big questions, and what those three big questions are this. First, and most importantly, the ultimate question being, how has and how is the character of global geopolitical competition changing? How has it changed? How is it changing? And to what impact, good, bad, and ugly, right? In as broad a sense as you can imagine that question in terms of its impacts and implications. Second follow-on question, the penultimate question. Therefore, then and only then, how do we need to relook and rethink uses and utilities of force, the joint interagency, intergovernmental, multinational, commercial force, any instrument of force, martial, diplomatic, informational, developmental, et cetera, et cetera. How has that changed, and how must that use and utility of force for power purposes, how must it change in order to provide the nation and the community of nations the achievement of the purposes of those nations through the use and utility of force? And thirdly, the big question, which I really believe of the three, tells us whether the change moment that we're in at any given moment is in fact unique and peculiar. And that third question is this: while we, in our doings of things, in our use and utility of forces, and a large part of our conversation these next 2 days are rightly going to be focused on the use and utility of informational forces to include communication. While we may be doing on a day-to-day basis, while we may be doing employing force of all types right and rightly, we may be increasingly finding ourselves that even though we're doing things right, we may no longer be doing the right things, the fully right things. Still doing necessary things, but not necessarily meeting sufficiency. We've probably all at some point of our lives, professional and personal, recently, at least subconsciously asked that question, and we've come up with a puzzled answer. At least that's my first provocation on the table, that we've all in some form or fashion come to that paradox. I would offer, when you ask that question, you come to a paradox, and the answer is more, oops, we may not be doing all the fully right things, and we got to figure that out. That brings you to the first two of the three questions, the triad of questions that tells you that you are at a very unique moment in world history. Let me go back to this first question: how is geopolitical competition and the character thereof changed? I think we have a pretty good beginning of an answer to that question. I'm gonna put that on the table right now. Second provocation, and I'll say this simply put: we are living at and facing the challenges of a time when disruptive change and disruptive changes once again, and let me emphasize once again, because this is cyclical, once again continues to outpace organizations and organizational leadership's ability to see, to adjust and understand, to appreciate, to think, and to act fast, right? And at the heart of that, I believe, are two additional paradoxes, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the remainder of my time for the scene setter. The paradox of influence and the relationship of influence with power, and then secondly, but a carryover, the paradox of the interrelationship between power and force, right? And the puzzlement that lies therein. At the heart of those two paradoxes, I would offer, and not just applicable to the Indo-PACOM theater of concern, puzzlement, befuddlement to some degrees, as there becomes a rising tension, competition between the United States as a current great power, regulating power of the international Western liberal international system, and a rising power challenger called the People's Republic of China. I don't mean what I'm about to say in only that context. I mean it globally and beyond the peer-pacing competitor state of PRC. But these questions, and particularly that description of how has the character of geopolitical competition changed, how we address and how we answer that can find us placing ourselves into a Thucydides trapping moment, right? I'm assuming everyone understands what I mean by the Thucydides trap, most recently offered by Graham Allison, more recently, and in about 2,500 years ago or so ago, offered by the man himself, historian, Greek historian, soldier scholar, Thucydides, when he was trying to explain the conditions that led to a runaway situation that brought the great powers of the time into competition beyond the contact layer of competition in the direct conflict in a epochal war. But Thucydides' trap and conditioned state largely could be of our own making, right? A self-fulfilling prophecy. When we conflate and confuse the interrelationships between influence and power, and furthermore, add insult to that injury when we don't get the first ones right in the relationship therein, and it cascades into a double confusion and conflation of power, the relationship of power and force. Now, if we go back to and bring up that first slide that shows a Clausewitz cartoonish and confused, I'll just give everybody a chance to kind of look at some markers on the board. And this is a snapshot of probably 500 years of Western liberal tradition, international relations, theory, history, and practice, right? In terms of, and it starts with clean definitions, but perhaps definitions that have increasingly at an accelerated rate somewhat become more confused. They've always been confused and conflated, the big tenets of influence, power, and force, but perhaps with accelerated change of a compound security, context and nature and character, they've brought us to a point of not only conflation and confusion, but problematics. And I'll just give you a couple of minutes, everybody, just to look at this. These are definitions, Merriam-Webster's and longstanding Western tradition, international relations. Influence as it relates to power, right? And a couple of points to make here and to put in the middle of our mind, at least as we move forward in the next 2 days. Influence is seen both as an integrated part of power and or as an alternative to power, right? And most scholars and practitioners relate this to influence within power, within the power equation and the power dynamic itself, vice influence without power, outside of power relationships. My own research, for whatever it's worth, and my own practice tends to lean more towards influence and power as more of a symbiotic relationship. The yin and yang, perhaps, of a relationship of offensive and defensive uses of force, temporally for particular purposes at particular locations and during particular time periods, but a relationship, a mutually affecting symbiotic relationship nevertheless. Similar to power, particularly for those who believe that influence is an alternative to, the influence equation is an alternative to the power equation. Like power, influence can be measured both as a capability as well as a relationship. We start getting into this conversation of relationships, we should already in the back of our mind start having, start playing the pickup game of how this maybe particularly uniquely and even peculiarly relates to our specific interest and impacts on use and utility of special operations and special operations forces, past, present, and most importantly, future. Both power and influence are causal. They explain, right? This is one of the reasons why these two notions in international relations theory, history, and practice have for 150 to 200 years just in the American tradition cause a lot of confusion. And perhaps I'll put on the table more confusion more often than not than answers. Back to influence. A lot of people tend to focus on influence as the positive aim side, the non-coercive form of power, right? This notion would see the employment of force through operational ways and means of persuasion, non-lethal persuasion itself, more than compellence, right? It's a very interesting and important way of juxtaposing power and influence, particularly in an offense and versus defense context. Necessary, perhaps not sufficient, however, particularly when we reflect on our own experiences over the past several short years of the indirect, but nevertheless compelling feeling impacts of misinformation, use of force through misinformation and disinformation projects. Maybe not a physical hurt, but a cognitive, and a cognitive hurt and a hurt at the core will of an individual or an entire nation state's population group. When I start thinking and feeling and reflecting on those types of relationships of late, impacts on electoral systems by competitors through the so-called non-coercive form of influence through misinformation and disinformation uses of force, that seems and feels like compellence to me. So perhaps we have to be careful about how much we make a grand distinction between the two. Influence is more about persuading, as many believe, others to change their minds instead of being coerced to do so. I've already made a major point there of contention. Hopefully our panelists can actually play that out as we go forward. And last point on this particular focus on the relationship of influence and power, more about allies when we're talking about influence than adversaries, perhaps. More about coalition partners than conflict partners, perhaps. When we're talking about influence, again, this comes from the tradition of thinking about influence as different than and outside of the relationships of power, looking at power more coercively, influence more cooperatively. Regardless, that target leans us towards what I would say a good old-fashioned B.H. Littleheart indirect approach. In that sense of an indirect approach or an irregular approach, brings these big questions of strategic influence and information advantage through use of information forces right to the core history, heritage, traditions of special operations and special operations forces. Hey, can I have the next slide, please? And I'll speed up. I see the session time running short. Second paradox follows the first, and I call it a true tragedy of American Western power: the conflation and confusion of power with force. Note the first bullet: power and force are not the same. Right? Isaac Newton told us this over 300 years ago in his simple equation for power, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide in different permutations. Power equals work over time. Like an artist, a great power can be considered, good, bad, and ugly, as a benevolent or belligerent power, and superpower, a regulating force, based on the body of their work over time. And more often than not, like the artist, not really appreciated by those closest to them in life until their death, right? So chew on that for a little bit, let that haunt us. It certainly haunts me over the years and has robbed me of more than a few nights or months of sleep thinking about that in the sense of where America stands on the rise, the plateau, the decline, and potential fall of all great powers, and how influence and persuasion can extend the life of a great power, particularly when power is understood as more than just the use and utility of blunt instrumental force, right? And I've given you enough time to look at some of the paradoxes within the paradoxy of this relationship between force and power, something to haunt us intentionally as we go forth for the next 2 days. And as we rightly focus on conversations of informational forces and the use and utility therein, our constant reminders of self and one another that we're talking about informational force. What does that mean to what higher end when it comes to power outcomes, right? Because they are not the same. Next slide, please. Real quick on describing the strategic environment. Simply put, I don't have a whole lot of time to put into this. We are talking about a fourth age of SOF propositionally, and at the core of that fourth age of SOF is a characterization, a description of and an explanation of a characterization of geopolitical change as one of compounded security competition. Think about the goodness of compound interest. A little dollar average investment in, you get exponential yields. Think of the darkest side of that coin, and you can get a general enough understanding, appreciation of what might an environment of global security affairs more impacted by a compound security dilemma and spiral theory rather than a simple additive, discrete threats-based balance of power system, right? It changes the calculations of force, how much you need in what combinations. It also changes the equation of risk mitigation of negative risk, and most importantly for SOF, the positive aims of risk taking using forecasting and foresighting analytics and instruments of empowerment. You can see the points I make there. I make 5 points when it comes to describing the strategic environment. We must do all of those things from the regional theater strategic level, I would offer, all the way down to the grand tactical level. Key point, we must adopt maxi-min strategic approaches, producing maximum effects at minimum cost, and focus those at very specific pinpoint places on the global map, those nexuses, those critical nodes, those pivot spaces, where we can provide asymmetrical positional advantages, physical, human, and cognitive, Key effort there on the informational, the uses of informational forces for strategic influence advantage, to produce strategic effects at those places and timings that have, through history, shown themselves to be the determinative places of overmatching compounding threats. And I have a map here in a second. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Next slide, please. There's the map. 4 classic uses and elements of force for power purposes. The use of force for power purposes to compel self and other, to deter, not only in terms of by denial and punishment, but I would offer a third leg to produce a remarkable Clausewitzian-like trinity of deterrence by punishment, by denial, but also the positive aims of influence in an anticipatory way, defending, strong pointing as George Kennan, the late great George Kennan offered, the power of defending. Clausewitz calls the defense the stronger form of war because of its strong pointing aspects. In this very ambiguous, but very intriguing fourth type and element of force for power purposes, to swagger. That brings in roles of influence, informational advantage, shows of force, stratagems, deception, everything in between. That seems to be very rich ground for thinkers and doers relating to the use and utility of special operations and special operations forces to spend a lot of time on in that swaggering category of uses of force for power purposes. 19 to 20 places on the global map that constantly keep recurring, going back past the time of Thucydides 2,500 years ago. These are places where physical and human security come into collision. They compound, they create compounding security competition spaces and threats. Whoever gets to those commanding heights is the proposition on the table. First mover advantage to get at or proximate to those locations with true enduring allies and anchoring partners, and an understanding of the relationship and the difference between, but the mutual relationship between power and force for influence outcomes. Checkmate. That is the proposition. These are the places and spaces where I would offer use and utility of special operations and special operations forces of all types, all core activities, through particularly the 3 of 5 core competencies of resilience and resistance building, strategic and operational influence through information advantage, reinforcement in the strategic and informational use of intelligence hyper-enabled by emergent technology for enhanced anticipatory judgment-based foresighting decision-making and risk management. Those are the 3 places that form the heart of an irregular deterrent triad that we must bring forward into this fourth age for success.